For over 4 decades, the savage murder of Bob Crane has lingered like a shadow over Hollywood, unsolved, unanswered, and shrouded in whispers. Now, after years of silence, his own son has come forward, and his shocking words confirm the darkest suspicions. This isn't just the tale of a beloved TV star's tragic end, it's a labyrinth of secrets, betrayal, and a chilling truth that was hiding in plain sight all along. In the early 1960s, Bob Crane wasn't just another actor hustling for a break, he was Hollywood's next golden boy. With a magnetic smile, razor-sharp comedic timing, and a charm that seemed effortless, he quickly rose through the ranks to become one of television's most beloved faces. His big break came with Hogan's Heroes, a daring World War II sitcom that turned a Nazi prisoner of war camp into an unlikely stage for sharp wit and clever schemes. For 6 seasons, Crane embodied Colonel Robert Hogan, the smooth-talking, quick-thinking American officer who could outsmart his captors with a grin. The show was a smash hit. Audiences adored him. Critics applauded him. And to millions, Bob Crane became the very definition of wholesome, all-American entertainment. But behind the bright lights and roaring laughter was a side of Crane the cameras never caught, a side far removed from the family-friendly hero America thought they knew. His charm was magnetic, but it also hid deeper, more complicated layers. Away from the set, Crane's personal life was tangled in secrets, temptations, and choices that would eventually cast a dark shadow over his legacy. It was a hidden world, running parallel to his fame, that would one day collide with tragedy in the most shocking way imaginable. Bob Crane was Hollywood's golden boy, a media darling with a quicksilver wit, the charm of a born entertainer, and the smooth confidence of a seasoned radio man. His years as a disc jockey had taught him how to read people instantly, disarm them with humor, and make them feel like the center of the room. On television, he radiated warmth, relatability, and squeaky clean charisma. It was the image studios wanted America to believe, and for a time, they succeeded. But behind that polished smile, a different story was quietly taking shape, a story of a man wrestling with restlessness, temptation, and an appetite for more than fame alone could satisfy. Even as Crane's career soared, subtle cracks began to show. He developed an intense fascination with technology, especially audio and video gear, at a time when most people hadn't even seen a home video camera. At first, it looked like an innocent hobby, just another quirk of a star with a taste for the latest gadgets. But the habit grew darker. Crane began bringing cameras and recorders everywhere, capturing not just rehearsals or on-set pranks, but deeply personal, intimate moments never meant for public eyes. Behind closed doors, his marriage to his high school sweetheart, Terzian, was unraveling under the weight of fame, long absences, and secrets that no smile could hide. The long hours, the female admirer's attention, and the increasing separation. The cracks soon were too big to ignore. In 1970, they got divorced. Crane promptly got married again, this time to Sigrid Valdis, his co-star from Hogan's Heroes. However, even that partnership would not endure. Crane was no longer the main attraction on network television by the middle of the 1970s. He was having trouble finding work, and his career was deteriorating. He performed in dinner theater shows. Far away from the limelight he previously held. The former star of one of the most popular television programs was now trying to maintain what little reputation he still had by performing in small venues around the nation. However, despite his career's decline, Crane's personal life was becoming even more bizarre. He had immersed himself in a world that few were aware of, one that was driven by compulsive behavior, voyeurism, and more dubious decisions. He met a man here who would shape the remainder of his life and, ultimately, his demise. Off-screen, Bob Crane was sinking into a reality that few could have predicted, despite being the golden kid on screen. A man caught between the image he sold to America and the secrets he kept hidden behind his doors, between public admiration and private obsession. And what followed would permanently ruin his legacy in addition to destroying the illusion. Bob Crane's private life was becoming increasingly complicated and unsettling by the time his television celebrity had begun to wane. What had started out as a harmless interest in photography had turned into an obsession. Crane was doing more than simply recording his professional life. He was obsessively documenting his private life, particularly his interactions with women. He used cameras, lights, and tripods to record everything, frequently without completely revealing his goals. He was still the friendly TV personality to the outside world. But something far darker consumed him behind closed doors. John Henry Carpenter came into the picture during this time. Carpenter, who worked as a regional sales manager for Sony Electronics, gave Crane video equipment and soon became good friends with him. However, their bond went beyond simple friendship. It was an unsettling collaboration. They led a perverse lifestyle together that was focused on control, surveillance, and seduction. Carpenter would frequently travel with Crane, assisting in luring women back to hotel rooms where the two men would record private moments on video. Many of these women were unaware that they were being filmed. The toll of this double life started to mount. It wasn't merely a personal thrill that drove Crane to become addicted to these encounters and to chronicling them. It turned into a major aspect of who he was. He carefully categorized his tapes, keeping them in boxes with names and dates written on them. Intimacy and connection were no longer important. It had to do with evidence, control, and the obsessive drive to repeat past events. He had lost his sense of the present. He had it archived. His closest friends and family began to notice changes. He grew more and more alone, emotionally aloof, and suspicious. His friendships were eroding, and his second marriage was failing. Once captivating millions with his charm and humor, the man was now reclusive, unpredictable, and enmeshed in his vices. He grew increasingly cut off from the rest of his life the more he indulged in his private world. Crane was incapable or unwilling to stop, despite the decline of his profession and the disintegration of his personal life. Despite mounting anxiety and discomfort, he continued to film, to gather, and to keep Carpenter by his side. Rumor had it that Crane wished to sever connections in order to escape the hold this way of life had on him. However, Carpenter was a man who did not give up easy. Crane was leading a parallel life, one that was full of secrets he never imagined being revealed. But in the most violent and visible way possible, everything he had worked so hard to achieve, his celebrity, his connections, even his carefully guarded private life, was about to fall apart. Bob Crane was discovered dead after a bludgeoning in his Scottsdale, Arizona, residence early on June 29, 1978. It was a gruesome and uncannily accurate scene. His body was found in bed with severe head damage and a camera tripod cord around his neck. The walls and ceiling were splattered with blood, but there were no direct witnesses, no evidence of forced entry, and no stolen items. It was an intimate, well-planned murder that stunned the country. The news of Crane's passing struck Hollywood like a lightning strike. Initially, it was just the startling killing of a former TV personality. However, the story took a turn for the worst as more details came to light. Inside the apartment, investigators soon discovered a tangle of electronics, photos, and videotapes. Uncomfortably detailed footage of Crane's private life was captured in dozens of reels. Colonel Hogan had vanished, to be replaced by a man at the heart of a sinister mystery. John Henry Carpenter became the immediate focus of the investigation. Only the previous evening had he spent time with Crane. After discussing their tense friendship over dinner, they went back to their separate rooms in the same apartment building. Carpenter was questioned by police, who discovered that the two had been fighting. According to rumors, Crane had told Carpenter that their friendship and all of its associated things had to cease. Carpenter acknowledged spending that evening in Crane's apartment, but asserted that Crane never came back. But in Carpenter's rental car, authorities discovered blood stains that matched Crane's blood type. The breakthrough ought to have come from this. However, there was an issue. In 1978, DNA technology was non-existent. The blood could not be positively matched. Furthermore, the case became weaker every day in the absence of a murder weapon. Even worse, some evidence appeared to disappear. Samples of blood were handled improperly. Crucial physical evidence was either never gathered or was tainted. Much of the evidence that may have directly linked Carpenter to the crime was lost forever due to the disorganized nature of the initial inquiry. There was a suspect in custody. They had a reason. Even if they had circumstantial evidence, it was insufficient to make an arrest. Bob Crane's image continued to deteriorate as the media frenzy grew more intense. His private existence seemed to be the main topic of every article about his murder rather than the case's resolution. The man who used to make America laugh was now a regular on the tabloids. He is remembered for the gloom surrounding his death rather than his brilliance. For years, Carpenter was free. Furthermore, the case gradually started to lose public attention because no one else was even seen as a credible suspect. However, it never really went away for Crane's family and the one individual who never gave up on the idea that justice may be served. The murder investigation of Bob Crane was beset by errors from the start. They had a clear motive, a definite suspect, and even trace evidence that would link Carpenter to the crime, according to detectives. However, they lacked the scientific knowledge and the determination to see the case through to the end. And the little proof they did have started to elude them over time. Almost instantly, the crime scene had been tainted. In the hours after Crane's body was found, curious neighbors, inexperienced police officers, and even members of the media were permitted to stroll around the apartment. Important evidence, such as the murder weapon, was never located, and forensic procedures were irregular. Although the video equipment was boxed up, it was never carefully examined for fingerprints or other forensic information, even though it might have included more clues. The way the blood evidence was handled was even more incriminating. Investigators found little bloodstains in Carpenter's rented car, which was outside the apartment building. When the blood was analyzed at the time, it was determined to be Bob Crane's blood type. However, that was insufficient in the 1970s. Prosecutors were concerned that blood typing would not stand up in court since it was too general and lacked DNA. The samples were put aside. However, many were mismanaged, lost, or deteriorated beyond use over time. Nevertheless, the demand for answers grew. Since Crane was well known, the media paid close attention to the scandalous circumstances surrounding his passing. However, Hollywood was unwilling to delve farther since it was already shaken by its image issues in the 1970s. Many people in the profession discreetly distanced themselves from Crane because of his embarrassing secret life. The lawsuit languished without institutional or public backing. When Scottsdale investigators chose to re-examine the case with modern technologies in the early 1990s, it generated fresh attention. Finally, DNA analysis was a practical instrument. They re-examined the original blood samples taken from Carpenter's vehicle. Even when a few traces could still be used, the results were not conclusive. The DNA was incomplete, deteriorated, and finally insufficient to provide a conclusive match. In 1992, Carpenter was charged with murder. Nevertheless, the trial would conclude with doubt, just as the initial inquiry had. The prosecution made extensive use of circumstantial evidence throughout the trial. They depicted a man who was despised and in need, as well as a friendship that had degenerated into something toxic. However, the defense retorted with plausible justifications and highlighted the absence of tangible proof. Following a well-reported trial, Carpenter was found not guilty in 1994. Until his passing in 1998, he insisted in his innocence. The result was heartbreaking for Crane's family. The only individual ever taken seriously as a suspect had just left. And the case was essentially deemed dead because there were no fresh leads, no conclusive evidence, and a story that the public was getting sick of. Not everyone, though, was prepared to let it go. One individual has spent decades living under the shadow of that tragedy. Someone who was aware that his father's grave did not contain the truth. And he was at last prepared to speak after years of quiet. Bob Crane Jr. for decades avoided being in the spotlight. He quietly established a life away from Hollywood while the media was consumed with his father's shocking demise. Beneath that quiet, however, was a boy who had experienced the confusion, the rumors, and the unsolved questions. And he concluded in recent years that it was time to face the reality that the world had long disregarded. Bob Jr.'s choice to come out was accompanied by interviews and, most significantly, a memoir that reveals the truth about what actually transpired behind closed doors. His remarks go beyond those of a distraught son. They are the story told by someone who actually lived in the story. Someone who saw his father sink into a world of celebrity, secrecy, and a bond far darker than the public ever realized. The extent of Bob Crane Jr.'s knowledge, even at the time of the murder, is among the most shocking discoveries. He talks about discovering dozens of cassettes, notes, and journals when he went through his father's house following the crime. Police had never examined some of these objects. Family members discreetly withdrew others, perhaps out of embarrassment or fear. Crane Jr. asserts that his father's way of life was not only careless but also harmful, and he thinks his father discovered this too late. Speaking candidly, he accuses John Henry Carpenter of being domineering and manipulative. Crane Jr. said his father had made several attempts to get away from Carpenter, but Carpenter always managed to get back in. He claims that although their connection was founded on a shared devotion, it eventually became a one-sided preoccupation. Carpenter, he said, was more than a friend. Even when Bob Crane's life was unraveling, he was the one who needed to be in charge of it. The fact that Crane Jr. claims that warning indicators were disregarded is possibly the most horrifying aspect of his story. Bob Sr. had been afraid in the weeks before the murder. He had admitted to close pals that he was being followed and watched. He had even begun recording strange phone conversations and arguments. Although no one took it seriously, Crane Jr. thinks his father knew something was coming. His autobiography is more than just a way for him to vent. It directly contradicts the official story. It charges that the legal system gave up too easily and failed to defend a guy attempting to flee a world that had already engulfed him. Most importantly, it doesn't allow the narrative to conclude in quiet. Because this was never just a murder to Bob Crane Jr. It was about revealing the truth and what so many had attempted to ignore. Something had changed in the last weeks of Bob Crane's life. His friends observed that he seemed tight, preoccupied, and frequently glanced over his shoulder. He had started complaining about the individuals in his immediate vicinity, particularly John Henry Carpenter. As stated by Bob Crane Jr., his father was becoming more and more determined to break away from the kind of life they had created together. The excitement had faded. It was oppressive. Crane began to postpone Carpenter's appearances. He was attempting to re-establish boundaries by withdrawing from their shared activities. He talked of severing ties with Carpenter and the whole web of secrecy that had taken over his life in talks with intimate pals. He desired to return to his roles as a working actor, a parent, and a man free from shadows. Carpenter, however, was unwilling to be disconnected so quickly. Crane was clearly unsettled by the arguments, heated discussions, and phone calls. Crane Jr. claims that 2 nights before the murder, one of these calls occurred. He recalls a statement made by his father that troubled him for years. "Look at John. If I die, look at John." In retrospect, it reads more like a warning, a last-ditch effort to be heard before it was too late, even though at the time it sounded like psychosis. Isolation marked Crane's final days. He appeared more aloof than ever, despite being on tour for a play. He was described by co-workers as being extremely serious and quickly upset. He had even started to discuss retiring completely, stopping the touring, abandoning the stage, and beginning anew. However, none of those plans would ever materialize. He had supper with Carpenter the night before he was murdered. It was reportedly their last effort to make things better. The meeting was a failure. Crane made it apparent that this was the end, according to sources. After that, they split up. There would be no more Carpenters, tapings, or vacations. Crane's body was discovered in his bed the following morning. No broken locks or indications of forced entry. Whoever killed him had either been invited in or had by no means left. For Crane Jr., the pieces had been too apparent to ignore. A deteriorating friendship, a father looking to break out, the timing of it all, and a suspect with every purpose to silence him. It became not just tragic, it turned into calculated. And yet, nobody had listened. However, Bob Crane's son might now not live silent all the time. He knew the tale changed into not over. Not yet. And if justice might not come from the courts, he changed into determined to bring it from the fact itself. Extra than 4 many years after Bob Crane's demise, his tale maintains to echo. Not simply because of its mystery, but because of what it reveals about fame, secrecy, and the way without difficulty justice can slip through the cracks. This turned into now not just a homicide. It changed into a cautionary tale, one that challenges the way we don't forget celebrities and the systems intended to guard them. Bob Crane's public photograph became cautiously curated. He turned into the fascinating TV hero, a symbol of wit and decency at the small screen. But underneath the spotlight became a man deeply afflicted, wrestling with compulsions he could not manipulate. And whilst his selections might also have contributed to the chaos that ate up him, the failure of the people around him and the institutions tasked with investigating his demise is what made the tragedy everlasting. In lots of approaches, the world became now not geared up to face the entire reality of Bob Crane's existence while he died within the 70s. The concept that a cherished sitcom star can be concerned in any such controversial way of life changed into too uncomfortable to confront. The media selected to sensationalize the scandal, and the justice system selected to tread gently. As opposed to clarity, there has been silence. Rather than solutions, there have been rumors. But these days, with present-day forensic technology, new equipment for virtual research, and a growing willingness to restudy cold instances, Crane's story has begun to resurface. Real crime documentaries, investigative podcasts, and interviews with Crane Jr. have reignited public hobby. Human beings want solutions due to the fact now the gear that have been once lacking may in the end be to be had. Crane Jr. has been one of the loudest voices calling for a re-exam of the case. He has advised government to reopen the investigation, the use of state-of-the-art technology. Superior DNA checking out, digital photo evaluation, and even psychological profiling ought to shed new light at the evidence that become as soon as dismissed. While some important pieces may be misplaced all the time, others would possibly nonetheless maintain secrets waiting to be uncovered. Past the technical side, there's something deeper at play, something greater human. Crane's story forces us to reckon with the value of silence, the hazard of neglected warnings, and the manner reputation can defend both the innocent and the guilty. It demanding situations the idea that point always brings closure. Because in this case, time delivered simplest more questions. And even as Bob Crane can be gone, his son's voice grows louder with every passing 12 months. He refuses to let his father be remembered completely for the scandal. He wishes the fact out, now not only for justice, but for history. To show that in the back of every headline is a real individual, a own family left in portions, and a fact that still subjects.